Welcome along to this session. So my name's Heather, and myself and my colleague Bryony are going to talk a little bit about a research project that we worked on last semester, where we were discovering the ways in which students are using GAI tools for planning essay style assessments. So we're going to talk through what we found out and what we think some of the next steps might be. So we did an initial piece of research back in 2023 when we were asking students whether or not they were using or had considered using GAI tools for various purposes. And from that, we developed an understanding that students were using them or were thinking about using them. But our initial survey didn't really give us too much in-depth information into how they were using them or what tools they were specifically choosing. So we wanted to develop a bit more of an in-depth understanding of how students are using these types of tools, which ones they're choosing, and also their sort of levels of confidence and proficiency in these. So essentially, we planned a user experience study to produce a bit of a clearer picture of the processes that students choose to follow when they're faced with more of an essay-based assignment and the reasons for their decision-making throughout the process. So in order to find some participants to take part in our research, a survey for students to express their interest in taking part was created during using JISC online surveys. And this survey was open for 2 weeks at the start of semester 2 last academic year and promoted via an announcement sent to all students via Canvas. We asked the students' name, email, school, level and year of study, and we also asked them to rate themselves in their confidence in using GAI technologies. So from 1, really not confident, to 5, feeling very confident. We had 948 students complete the expression of interest survey. So in order to choose 30 participants to actually take part in the study, we exported the responses and then sorted them by level of confidence. We wanted to have an equal number of students identifying at each level, so we used an online number generator to randomly select from each category. So we had 6 students at each of the 5 levels of confidence. In terms of our selected participants, we had 14 from humanities and social sciences, 8 from health and life sciences, and 8 from science and engineering. In terms of level of study, 10 of our participants were postgrad and 20 were undergrads. So in terms of what we did when they came along for their research slot, the hour-long slots took place in a study room in the library. The students logged into a laptop provided, watched a short video explaining the research study, and were given the opportunity to ask us any questions. Each student was then given 3 essay questions to choose from, which all related to their subject area, and they were told that they needed to pick one to focus on within the session. They were then given 50 minutes to research the topic, use and make notes from any sources they normally would for their assignments, and put together an initial plan for their essay. Everything they did was recorded using Canvas Studio Screen Recorder, and they were encouraged to narrate and talk through their process and why. They were informed that for any part of the process, if they deemed it useful or appropriate, they could use GAI technologies if they wished. Once the slot was complete, the recording was saved and the student was rewarded with an Amazon voucher. The recordings were then reviewed by ourselves and 3 members of our student team, and a Word document detailing the processes the student followed was created for each. So in terms of what we found that 21 of our 30 students, so 70%, used AI in the planning and researching process. And 7 of the students chose to use more than one GAI tool or technology. There was definitely a positive correlation between the confidence that they sort of rated themselves in using the GAI and whether or not they chose to use it at all in the study, and also correlation between their self-reported confidence and the number of uses that they chose to use it for. ChatGPT was by far the most popular tool used. So 18 of our students chose to use this. We did see a variety of other tools being selected, some of which we had ourselves never heard of before. So it was quite interesting to sort of see what our students were choosing to use. But GPT by far and away was the one most selected by the students in our research.
Okay, thank you, Heather. So in terms of the ways that the students actually use the GAI, we've got a table here which just lists some of the most common uses. So asking for an explanation, a definition, or an example was by far and away the most commonly used one, although actually also followed by generating an essay plan. So these two were probably the most used of all of those types of use. But we also did see students using this to paraphrase their work or reword their own words as well. We were maybe surprised to see that they also used GAI to recommend sources as well. They used it to paraphrase and to summarize sources, and there's a few other things listed there as well, including getting feedback on their work too. 15 of the students who used the GAI used them in more than just one way throughout that whole process. And as Heather mentioned, we did find that strong positive correlation between the confidence in GAI and the number of ways in which that GAI technology was used. Here are just a few examples of some of the prompts that the students used in the study. So here we have, examples of asking for an example, of creating that draft of an essay plan as well, thinking about the structure of it, using it to paraphrase or reword their own work as well. So they noted, for example, can you still write this in the same style? And also, as I said, actually using the GAI technologies to recommend sources in the first place. We did have a couple of students who used GAI in a way that was not appropriate. I'll talk a little bit more about some of those examples later on, but for example, we did have a student who asked to write a whole introduction for their report, so for their basically their essay question. Now, we don't know if the student would have actually included that word for word in their final essay, or whether they were just using this for inspiration. So we can't say that they've used it inappropriately at this point. They might simply have just been using the GAI to try and give them an idea of how they should structure their work or the kind of content that should be there as well. So they did also have prompts to look at alternative terms as well, which is actually a very good use of GAI because that's something we try and encourage in the library. Try and think of your alternative terminologies when you're searching for sources so that you don't miss anything. Asking for feedback. So is this plan of my essay, does this look okay? This is the sort of thing that the students were asking about. And they even used it to try and help them do a bit of referencing or to put their referencing into a particular type of format. So in this case, it was the style used in law for Oscola. I should say as well that although I have highlighted one student there who didn't use the technologies appropriately, and I will talk about a couple more examples later. Actually, the main thing that we noticed was that most of the students did actually use GAI in quite an appropriate way. Now, I know that you could argue that we are in a study condition and they were being recorded, but we did try to reassure them how we could not share any of their information. And we did have students ask us, is it for certain that you can't share this? And we would say, yes, of course. So we like to think that perhaps this is fairly representational of what the students would do in the real world as well. So of the 21 students who chose to use GAI, we did find that over half of them indicated they had some awareness of the limitations. Now, we didn't ask a specific question about the limitations, so it is possible that more of the students were aware of them. But on the other hand, the fact that we didn't ask them is quite promising, that they volunteered the information, that they knew that there were caveats. So for example, people saying that they don't trust it completely, but that it is quite a good starting point. To be aware that things can get made up to some extent as well, and to not just wanting to use it blindly either. And also to reread and make sure that what it's saying is actually correct too. And there was a student who was under the impression that if you used a ChatGPT to write your whole essay, that it probably wouldn't actually give you an essay that would give you good marks anyway. So there was certainly awareness with the students, completely brought up by themselves without any prompt from us, to show that they were aware of the limitations. In terms of starting searches, so again, this is a bit more of a library question. This is something we're quite interested in. Where are students starting their search from? So we could see that over half the students were using Google in some capacity. So whether that was the basic Google search or whether it was starting off at Google Scholar, that was the most popular place that students went to start their search. We were, I guess, pleasantly surprised that looking at either subject databases or library search was still making up about a quarter of the places that the students started their searches. So although in an ideal world, we'd love this to be maybe a bit bigger, it probably isn't too bad when you consider the availability of things like Google Scholar and GAIs. And then in terms of the GAIs, again, ChatGPT was used as a starting point 17% of the time, and then Perplexity was also used as well. But it was only 6 of the students, just to put that into context, who actually began their search process using a GAI. And again, it's a bit of a sort of library question here, was thinking about the referencing of their sources. So we found that about 80% of the students did include some form of reference in the essay plan stage. So that is quite encouraging. This number starts to go down a little bit when we look to see if the students were consistently matching the reference information to the actual information in their essay plan. So this is already starting to give us an idea of where potential issues around academic misconduct can occur. So it's already starting to happen at the essay planning stage. They're taking information from sources, but they're not making it absolutely clear in their essay plan where they've got that information from. And interestingly, none of the students created a reference for any of the GAI tools that they'd used throughout the process. Now, it could be that in the final essay, if they were to use something like a direct quote, maybe they would mention this, they would acknowledge it, they would reference it. So perhaps they don't consider it worthy of mentioning in their plan, a bit like how you might not say that you've used Google, for example. But it again can lead itself to the issue that if a student did take some information from a GAI, they might just lose track of the fact that they did get it from a GAI and that it wasn't their own idea. So I mentioned earlier about a couple of interesting cases. So we also had a student who was fairly confident in using GAI technologies, where they pasted a sentence word for word from a journal article into Quillbot and then asked it to paraphrase. And they also stated that Quillbot paraphrases your text so that you're not plagiarizing, which was interesting. They also then took sentences from ChatGPT and then they put them into Quillbot to try and disguise the fact that they had originally got them from ChatGPT. So that was sort of actively trying to disguise the use of it. And they even said that they were paranoid that a plagiarism detector would find out if they had copied and pasted directly from ChatGPT into their essays. They're being quite ingenious here, trying to disguise their use, when actually it would be simpler for them to maybe just say how they've used their GAIs in their work. And then we had a student as well, participant 5. So they actually used Perplexity to find their sources originally. They said that they liked Perplexity more than ChatGPT because it provides sources. But what was interesting is that when they then tried to follow up the information that had been presented to them as coming from a particular source, they used Control F to try and find that information, and they couldn't actually find it in the source that the technology had told them that the information had come from. But they still used the information regardless of the fact that they couldn't verify that it had actually come from that particular source. We did also have one student who we just want to note was probably quite an advanced GAI user because they were doing a postgraduate degree in data science and AI. And what they did is they only used GAI technology. So you could argue that's not ideal, but maybe considering their subject, that might explain partly why. So they would actually use 3 different GAIs, put the same thing or the same prompt into each one and compare the 3 to see which of the 3 was best. So they were probably one of the only students who actually did a direct comparison between different GAIs in order to decide how they were then going to include that information. But perhaps a little concerning that they weren't going to use any other sources at that point. Okay, so we do have a bit of a poll for you. So I'll bring it up on the slide shortly, but if you want to just use your phones or whatever to use the QR code there, that will take you to our poll. And we're just interested to know how you have found that other ways students are using GAI tools. If it does prompt you, the poll everywhere, to register for credits, just ignore that. You don't need to do that to take part. The QR code is also on the top right-hand side of the screen if you do need that. So I'll just wait a few minutes to let you fill in that response. So we are getting some interesting things through, some of which are similar to what we found in our study. So summarizing, for example, yes, we've got someone writing an essay plan, someone saying none currently, interestingly, perhaps they're not allowed to use it in that particular subject as well. I noticed someone said about writing an abstract. Maybe that's genius because you put all the work into writing your main report, for example, and then you need to try and find a way of condensing it. So maybe it's a good starting point to help you do that. Yes, to avoid self-plagiarism. Yes, that's true. If you've written methodology and it's the same methodology pretty much, and you've produced several articles from it, ideally you shouldn't be using the exact same wording. So I could see that people would use it for that too. Yeah, and writing emails. Yeah, spelling and grammar. Yeah, these are all the things that we would definitely expect to be happening. Writing an entire literature review. Okay, perhaps not ideal. Creating examples. I have to admit that I do use Copilot quite a lot to formulate examples. I don't always use the exact example it's given me, but it just gives me an idea. And then I think, actually, yes, now I can think of my own example. So it's actually pretty handy for that, I think. Yes, planning, structure, generating ideas. Yeah, some staff aren't really aware that students are using GAI much in their subjects, which I guess is going to be the case for some as well. Okay, so that's really interesting. You can continue to add to that. We might have a little look at that later. But yes, I think I'm going to hand back to Heather now.
Thank you. So in terms of what our sort of next steps are from our study, we have been in conversations with CIE in terms of using our research to update university guidance. Obviously, we could see from our study that a lot of students were using GAI to create a plan, which isn't sort of specified necessarily in the guidance as to whether or not that is acceptable. So it would be quite useful to have sort of a clear sort of sentence in there about planning. And also some more clear guidance on whether using tools to paraphrase or reword your own work is acceptable, which we did find a few students doing. So just getting a bit of clarity on whether or not that is going to be part of the acceptable university-wide policy. We did find that students overwhelmingly chose ChatGPT. I think that there has obviously been a lot of sort of press around ChatGPT, and it's probably the one that people sort of initially think of when they think of GAI. But so there's probably more education needed on the benefits of some of the other tools, such as Copilot. So we're hoping to sort of update our know-how tutorial and our session guidance to make sure that students are aware that other options are available to them, and that they might be a bit more appropriate for some of the usages we have talked about. And also we want to look in a bit more detail into like the prompt literacy of students. So we're hoping to conduct another study in the upcoming academic year to explore this a little bit more, and to understand how competent students are in actually using prompts to get their desired outcome from technologies. So we can definitely see now that students are using them, and we can see some of the examples for which they've chosen to use them. And I guess we sort of see our role as sort of information professionals and learning developers as being able to help them get the best out of the technologies for the situations in which it's appropriate. We would ideally like our output from our next study to create a tutorial to maybe help guide students to improve how they sort of put those prompts in and get the best information out. So hopefully our study will identify where some of the weaker elements of usage might be in students and where they maybe aren't getting the best out of these technologies, as well as probably also identifying examples of good practice and the ways that students are using these technologies that perhaps we hadn't thought about or perhaps we hadn't thought would be useful. So trying to get as much evidence as we can essentially to build a tutorial that's hopefully going to be useful to students in the future. So that's coming to the end of our slides. So I'm just going to pop a link in the chat to our teaching form. So if anyone's interested in having a session for your students on GAI or indeed any other sort of academic skills, I'll pop a link in the chat to our teaching form so people can have a little look at that and request if anyone is interested. Or if you would like to get in touch with Bryony or myself, the know-how email address is probably the best, as you will reach both of us, and knowhow@liverpool.ac.uk. Okay, so we're happy to take any questions. I have been trying to answer a few of them in the chat as we've been going. I think the main one that I haven't answered, Bryony, which is probably your area of expertise, is from Regina asking, could you please share details of the ethics application process, including how long it took to get approved?
So yes, because this was quite low risk, don't underestimate how long it takes to complete the ethics form, because there's lots of things that you have to think about, and thinking in detail about your plan right the way through to data analysis and how you're going to store your data before you actually begin is always going to be it's going to make it a bit quicker, going to make that life a bit easier. You will of course also need to make sure that there's ethics training, because you'll come to a box near the end that asks for your ethics training number, so you do need to make sure that's done. And again, don't underestimate the difficulty or the time that can take. Once it's submitted, I found that it's actually quite quick, because we were submitting it to the board. I can't remember the exact name, but it's something along the lines of education. I think the Academy or CIE might be involved in that. So I find that they do look at it fairly quickly, because we're not taking any identifiable or risky information. We don't have anything that could identify a student really. We're not doing any kind of lab experiment. We're not taking any tissue or anything like that. We don't have to take, it doesn't have to go to like a full committee, I think is the right terminology. So I think just a reviewer or a couple of reviewers will look at it. And if it is quite low risk and you're not taking too much information, that goes through pretty quickly. I'd say within a couple of months that goes through, and sometimes we might make an amendment, and sometimes that can happen the next day that the amendment is approved. So actually it depends on the level. I think if you are going to be doing something that could cause people to become upset, or you were taking some really identifiable information, then it might have to go to a full committee, and they only happen at certain times of the year. So you would be a bit more time, we have to be more patient, because you have to wait for those committees to happen. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded.
Cindy's put in Professional Services Ethics Board. So I think
that's the one.
That's what you were looking for.
Probably, yes.
I think I answered most of the other questions. A couple of people were asking about if we recorded if they were home or international students, but we didn't, because we didn't have that in our ethics application, but something potentially to think about for next time.
Yes, and I think that we have made an amendment to this ethics application for our next study, and I wasn't quite sure where disability status stood on that, but we included a question that we would ask students in a survey to say, do you consider yourself to have a disability that affects your learning? And that actually just got accepted by the reviewer in the amendment. So obviously, because we weren't asking for anything too specific, that was deemed okay. So we will be able to add that to our information for the next time around. But again, just for the purposes of not having to take it to committee boards and everything, we haven't really asked about gender, ethnicity, or anything like that. So we won't know any of that information in our next study. But if anyone in the future wants to do a study like that, I'm sure you can. You just have to be prepared that you might have to go to a full ethics committee board if you're going to take a lot of information. Yes, I can see a hand up there.
Hi, sorry, it's can you hear me well?
Yes. Yes, we can hear you.
It was my question about international students. I'm Theodora from the Faculty of Health and Life Science, and I'm the director of a postgraduate MSc. So I did that similar things with my students during a seminar because I wanted to know how they use generative AI and so on. And they did indeed the rephrase. They show me how they rephrase that. So I was quite concerned because they don't think about what they're doing, and they copy sources, they rephrase it so to avoid plagiarism. And this is increasingly done by international students. This is why I asked about the survey, and probably, I'm not so much interested in gender and so on, but, the international students, because they have this language insecurity, I think they are more prone to use the generative AI to improve, how can I say, it's not necessarily to improve, but it is the general insecurity that makes them, trust more the technology than make the effort to write themselves an essay. And we struggle with them in terms of academic integrity. We have many, many cases, and it's really, really tiring. So that, I mean, if you want to continue the study, probably we can make a very good, you can make a very good argument about, the collecting only this particular data if they are home or international. And I'm not sure, according to GDPR, if that goes under protected category, because you don't ask about the specific ethnicity, you just ask home international. And so you avoid the GDPR specific special categories of data that will trigger, further ethics filters.
Yeah, so in our previous study, we did actually have that as an option, and it was accepted by the ethics reviewers as well, that we would ask students about whether English was a first language or not. That was a question that we were going to ask in a survey. However, we did some focus groups with some students to get feedback on our survey, and a few of them were questioning and slightly offended that we were asking them that question, because they felt that we were suggesting that people who don't have English as a first language were going to cheat. So that was reworded on the advice of a student who said, rather than asking if English was their first language or not, if we simply ask them their confidence in academic writing instead. So in our previous study, that's what we did. So rather than distinguishing between home student or international, we simply did it based on their confidence. Because in theory, if you are an international student, but you're actually exceptionally good at your writing your English, then in theory, you're not going to maybe behave as maybe you would expect, I don't know, but if you're a home student and you're not very confident in your academic writing, then you might seek these sources of support a bit more. So it may not be quite as clear-cut as international and home. It might be more about the general confidence. So actually in our next study, we're going to record their confidence in GAI, but also we're going to record their confidence in academic writing. So again, we might be able to see if there's some sort of relationship or correlation there between people's confidence, not just in the GAI technologies, but in their sort of academic writing abilities. So I'm hoping that will kind of help to answer your question a bit.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent idea. And you are completely right. That's what's about. Yeah, it's just, yeah, thank you.